Okay, hello everybody, welcome back. Just as usual, once again, I'm getting the stream going, and we have about 10 minutes until the actual lecture content starts. So get comfortable. Hopefully everything's going well for you, and we'll be ready to roll in just a little bit. Hi, Santina. Hi, Leanne. She's been really cute today, just hanging out with me a lot. Hey, Violet. So yeah, just another 7.5 minutes, pretty much. Hey, Jasmine. Hello. Hey, girl. Hey, Justin. Still just a little under 6 minutes to go till we get the lecture part going. Carson, welcome back. Jemin, hey. Good to see you there today. Okay, 5 minutes. She's just too cute. It's kind of just funny how she's always hanging. 4 minutes. Tyler, hello. Okay, just coming down to 3 more minutes left till we start. Just wait until 4, of course. You couldn't see the video. What do you mean now? You can't see it, or you could not see it before? Yes, no, that's okay. We were talking, right? We were chatting while the video kind of went down. The stream kind of went down for a minute because I guess the connection to the Wi-Fi got lost. No big deal though. You didn't really miss anything. I didn't deliver any further notes. Once the screen cut off, I noticed it pretty much instantly, and then we got into our little text-based chat. And I think I notified you that we would just kind of summarize and recap the last leftover points, but basically there wasn't too much more. So it's not. It's kind of like a moot point in a way, but yeah, not to worry. You're talking about a black screen at the end while you were watching live. I watched a playback, and the playback didn't include any kind of dead screen. It was just in the midst of my remarks, it just ends like abruptly. Hi, Rosemary, and hey, Karen. Welcome back. Cayenne, hello. Okay, guys, good. Just a couple more moments. We'll get started at 4. Daniel, welcome back. Hey, Zach, welcome back to you. Hello, Natalia. Elena, Mary Jane. Good to see everybody. Good to see you guys. Okay, just a few seconds and I'll get started right on time. All right, everybody. So we're pretty much now at our 4 o'clock hour, so I'm going to get things underway. And as always, just welcome back and good to see you. I hope you've been having a good week and a good day so far today. So let me just get us into our last lecture today on the whole animal ethics topic. I'll start, as often I do, by just reviewing the things from last time, and I'll make sure to cover the last couple of remaining little elements from the Immanuel Kant writing in our book. And Nick, Sandra, and all the rest, again, good to see you guys. Okay, so when we started last time, the first thing we covered was the writing of Carl Cohen. Carl Cohen's paper is called The Case for the Use of Animals in Biomedical Experiments. So, sorry, Peachy. Let me move her. I need my notebook. I'm sorry, girl. We'll hang out later. She's like clinging to me. Okay. Good girl. Yeah, so Carl Cohen. I'm sure I cover all the important notes on him. He starts by saying that some people oppose the use of animals in biomedical experiments, and they do so based on two primary reasons. One reason could be that it's argued it could violate their rights. Another reason is that it imposes too much avoidable suffering. And on both of those points, Cohen disagrees. He starts by saying animals do not have rights. Non-human animals don't have rights. They don't have rights at all, so there's no rights to violate. The reason he says that is because in order to have rights, to be a member of the moral community, if you like, to be a full holder of rights, you have to be a thing that is capable of making and responding to moral claims. He considers the whole concept of rights to be somewhat similar to the concept of having the capacity to raise claims and have them adjudicated within a community of moral agents. So, therefore, if it requires the capacity to make claims to be a member of the moral community, then only beings that have that ability have rights. And since animals don't have the capacity to comprehend claims, to raise them, to debate, discuss, or adjudicate them, they're not members of the moral community. That's why he thinks that if we use animals in these experiments, as painful as they may be, as life-threatening or even lethal as they may be in some cases to the animals involved, it doesn't violate the rights that the animals have because there's no rights. The rights are non-existent. It would have to be a case where you have the ability to make claims to even have the standing of having rights. So that's why he thinks that there's no deprivation or violation of rights involved in the use of animals in these experiments. Now, there's the case that can be made that if we don't think animals have rights because they lack the capacity for making moral claims or free moral judgment, whatever, that would also somehow exclude mentally disabled humans from the moral community as well, because they also lack the same capacity to make and respond to and evaluate moral claims. And he doesn't want to be taken to argue that humans with mental disabilities, etc., don't have rights on par with animals. So to kind of ward off that objection, he tries to distinguish between the status of the mentally disabled human and the animal that's being compared with it. And he basically affirms that the reason that the mentally disabled human has the rights that the animal lacks, even though they're both cognitively similar, is because they're members of a rational kind of species. They're still members of a species that, considered in general, would have the capacity to make moral claims. So infants, mentally disabled people, the people in advanced senility or dementia, brain damaged individuals and stuff like that, they would all be, as humans, members of a human race that generally does have the ability to make moral claims. And so he thinks that's enough of a basis for them to have the rights that are withheld from animals. He then considers the issue of speciesism. He thinks that it is an improper label to attach to people that are willing to use animals either in biomedical experiments or as food produced on factory farms, because it makes it seem as though it's the same kind of pernicious form of bigotry or discrimination that you see with racism or sexism. But he finds that to be an inappropriate comparison, because when people are treated differently merely because they have a different race or gender than you, the people that are being discriminated against in that case, the members of the other genders or races, they're relevantly similar to you in all, like legitimate and moral respects. They still are humans. They still have rational capacity to raise and respond to moral claims. So there's no difference. There's no morally relevant difference between humans of different races or genders. But if we diminish the standing of animals by comparison to humans, or we don't show equal regard for their pain or desire to avoid pain, that's fair because they, unlike in the case of discrimination amongst humans, are not equal to us. They lack this capacity for free moral judgment. They're on a lower tier. They're not inside the moral community for that reason. So he says speciesism is actually justified. It's totally reasonable to prioritize and favor the interests of your own species over the members of other species, because here, unlike racism, sexism, and these other forms of discrimination, there is a morally relevant difference between the being that has the higher status and the one that's not being granted it. He then talks briefly about the whole utilitarian side of the argument. The first part of what he has argued is mostly in line with Kantian moral principles, because he says we have no duties to things that don't have certain rational capacities, much like what Kant would say. But he also takes on the issue of utilitarian reasoning. He says if you're a utilitarian, you always weigh the total pains and pleasures created by each action in making a judgment as to what action is right or wrong. So he says if you're weighing the scales of pain and pleasure, you could look at these tests and biomedical experiments at least as resulting in some pain for the animals, but they deliver such immense utilitarian value in terms of total happiness as a result of the things discovered or determined by means of the experiments. So when we do these experiments, yes, the animals suffer, but what do we get for that? We get therapeutic treatments, medicines, prosthetic devices, surgical procedures. All those things are developed on testing that involves animal specimen. And when the procedures and techniques are perfected, they result in all kinds of happiness. So he thinks that the overwhelming benefits derived from the use of animals and the pain they suffer in such experiments is vindicated even on utilitarian grounds by the total value and happiness that's resulting as a consequence of those same experiments. Now, after that, we talked about the Kant, Immanuel Kant, and I think I mostly talked to you about everything that I wanted you to know from the article, but I know that we kind of broke off and the video cut out a little bit at the end, so I want to make sure that nothing's lost. Kant says that we have no direct duties to animals. We can treat them as a means to an end, unlike what's appropriate when dealing with other humans. Even though we don't have any direct duties to these animals because they lack moral reasoning and abstract thought, self-awareness, whatever, he does think that we have other kinds of duties to them. Does anybody remember this distinction or terminology point? No direct duties to the animals because they lack reason, etc. They lack moral autonomy and moral self-governance. But even though we have no direct duties to them, he argued that we have these others. What are they? Indirect duties, correct, Mary Jane. Now, to anybody watching or listening, thanks, Santino, correct as well. If we have indirect duties to the animals, what does that mean? He's saying that we don't owe anything directly to them because they're not members of the moral community. But what does an indirect duty mean in this context? That even if we have no direct duties to them, we shouldn't act towards them in what sort of ways, and why not? Not being necessarily mean, that's one way to put it. Mean, cruel perhaps, is another way to put the same. We shouldn't be unnecessarily cruel or abusive to them, but why not? What is the reason? Because he said we don't directly owe them anything. They have no rights. So what's the basis then for us having some indirect reasons to not be cruel, abusive, etc.? Santino, don't be cruel because we could harbor to do the same to humans. Yes, exactly. He says that a pattern of cruel, abusive, sadistic behavior directed at animals with no good cause will probably instill inside of you a general abusive tendency that's bound to show itself later in your dealings with humans. So to sort of practice kindness on the animals is something you ought to do, even though you don't strictly have an obligation to the animals themselves, but you do have obligations to other people to not treat them as means to an end or be cruel or brutal towards them. So he thinks that in order to sort of preserve our gentle treatment of other humans, we should practice kindness on the animals, not for the animal's sake, but for the sake of man. But his argument is compatible with still, again, using animals as means in all the familiar ways, using them as food, using them as medical experimental subjects, or using them as sources of fur or leather or whatever, or eggs or dairy. And why is that okay? Because he says that since we don't have any direct duties to them, it becomes acceptable to use them as long as there's a significant enough value to humanity for the way that we manipulate the animal. So, is it cruel to the animal perhaps to be subjected to suffering on factory farms? Sure, but that cruelty, he says, can be justified by a higher purpose, which is the providing of food and sustenance for humans. Or he talked about the vivisectionists, animal experimentation, basically. And he says that that's also cruel to animals when they're used as live experimental subjects in ways that could cause them pain, harm, or even death. But here again, the benefit derived to humanity from the experiments used vindicates the cruelty here. But he says, if the animal is subjected to pain, suffering, etc., for no important reason, like merely for sport, some people will just hunt, not necessarily to eat the food, not necessarily to learn anything biomedically by experimenting on the dead animal, but just to kind of get a trophy or even just for the thrill of the hunt itself. And he says killing animals for sport is sort of a violation of the indirect duty that you have to humans to preserve your gentle treatment of other humans. So I'll just read some of the words that I was reading when the video got cut off last time, where he talks about that. He says, tender feelings towards dumb animals develop humane feelings towards mankind. In England, butchers and doctors don't sit on a jury because they are accustomed to the sight of death and are hardened to it. Vivisectionists who use living animals for their experiments certainly act cruelly, although their aim is praiseworthy and they can justify their cruelty, since animals can be regarded as man's instruments. But any such cruelty for just sport cannot be justified. A master who turns out his donkey or his dog because the animal can no longer earn its keep manifests a small mind. Our duties towards animals, therefore, are indirect duties towards mankind. So that's about everything I wanted you to know mostly about the Kant. And keep in mind, as you're thinking about and writing and working on your papers, it does say to compare and contrast the Kantian view on animals with the utilitarian view. The Kantian view in Kant's own writing is pretty much anti-animal, with a little concession to the fact that we shouldn't be overtly cruel to them, but not on the basis that it matters to the treatment of the animals, but rather it's to preserve our gentle treatment of other fellow humans. And I find that Kant's position is much similar to the everyday common sense view that a lot of people have when they haven't really reflected much on the topic, if they were pressed to give an explanation of their moral feeling or thought about animals and the way that we use them. Most would probably say, I'm okay with eating meat or wearing leather or using things that were tested on animals perhaps. But I also don't believe in animal cruelty. I don't believe that people should torture animals or that animals should be exposed to excessively brutal and painful conditions as they're brought up to human use. So I think that Kant's position is kind of in a way overlapping with a lot of common views about the animals. And in terms of the other authors that we've read, Singer is definitely a more utilitarian-minded pro-animal advocate. He thinks that if you consider their pain and pleasure and you weigh it on par with human pain and pleasure, and if you adhere to the equal consideration principle, you can't justify sacrificing major interests of the animal to avoid pain and suffering and death for the sake of minor, unnecessary, or trivial interests of humans like the pleasures of the palate. Cohen is more of an anti-animal Kantian/utilitarian. The Kantian part of his argument is in line with when he says that animals lack rights because they lack the capacity to make claims or to engage in moral judgment. That's similar to Kant's view that animals without the capacity for reason or moral autonomy don't have any direct duties owed to them. But Cohen's also careful to say that even on a strictly utilitarian basis, his estimation of the total net value or net utility generated by the use of animals in biomedical experiments overwhelms and outweighs the total pain that they suffer, so that it's actually more utilitarian positive to use them for these experiments than it wouldn't have been. Regan, who we talked about last week, he is an interesting figure in the debate because he's totally pro-animal, but he goes farther than Singer to affirm that they actually have rights. And if they have rights, then just giving them more humane treatment wouldn't satisfy the moral obligations that we have. We would have to desist from anything that treats them as a means to our ends or that uses them for our purposes as though they were just things that have instrumental instead of inherent value. Regan criticizes along the way a utilitarian basis for morality as well as the cruelty kindness view and the contractarian view for reasons that we kind of explored earlier in the meetings. At the end, he kind of affirms kind of quasi-Kantian perspective. He takes on an element of Kantian thought, which is that there are certain beings that should never be treated as a means to an end, but he deviates from Kant in one important respect. Kant thought that it's only rational human subjects that are owed that kind of respect. But to Regan, it's anything that's just the subject of a life. So he kind of departs from maybe the letter of Kant, but he adheres to the spirit of it in a certain way because he kind of believes in the validity of the second version of the categorical imperative, just directed more broadly at not just rational animals like us, but any animals or any things that could be subjects of a life. So that can take us into today. We have just a few leftover authors on this topic. One of the authors, the one we're starting with, is a familiar figure to us by now because it's Mary Ann Warren. She's back again. Mary Ann Warren's paper is called The Rights of the Non-Human World. So I'm just opening my notes to that really quick. Okay. Mary Ann Warren, paper of 1983, and it's called The Rights of the Non-Human World. The Rights of the Non-Human World, Mary Ann Warren. So I'm sure you haven't forgotten, but again, Mary Ann Warren was one of our first authors in the semester when we talked about the whole topic of abortion. She wrote the famous paper, A Defense of Abortion. On the moral and legal status of abortion. Defense of Abortion, Thompson. On the moral and legal status of abortion, that's Mary Ann Warren. And you may remember that at that point, she was making the argument that abortion's not wrong, that it is morally permitted because the fetus, even though it's a living thing, is not a person. And only persons are members of the moral community with rights. So now we circle back to Warren because as a moral philosopher, she's got viewpoints and arguments concerning a whole range of topics, not just the abortion issue, but also this one related to, again, what's the proper moral treatment of animals, if anything. So again, yeah, she discussed abortion and the moral status of the fetus. Now she wants to get into the moral status of the animal. She begins by saying that in Western philosophy, the general consensus and the traditional view going a long time back has been that only humans are objects of direct moral concern, that only humans are members of the moral community, and that at best our duties to animals are just indirect, like Kant said. That is what she calls a homocentric view. We've used terminology when we first introduced this whole unit of the course. One term was biocentric and then anthropocentric. Her terminology or phrase, homocentric, is just a synonym for our earlier discussion of anthropocentric morality, which would say that only humans are specific objects of moral concern, and they're the only things that are members of the moral community. Homocentric meaning like Homo sapiens centered. So this homocentric view is kind of the traditional view that humans are the only real things that are in the moral community that we have moral obligations and duties towards and that have rights. But she says the homocentric or perhaps anthropocentric view could be challenged from two different directions. She distinguishes two positions that are contrary to the so-called homocentric position. One is the environmentalist position. So I'm going to put that in our chat. Environmentalism says that all living things, including the natural environment, have moral status. So environmentalism is a position that says it's not just me and you humans that have moral value and standing, or that should be protected or accorded rights, but that it's all living things. It's all living things, not even just all sentient things, but even like coral reefs, forests, the rainforest, the biosphere. So if you're an environmentalist, you believe in the protection of all things that are alive and the whole environment. That's a disagreement from homocentric morality that says we draw the circle of moral concern specifically around the human race exclusively. So this extends that moral community beyond the human race to other things that are alive and aspects of the environment too. Another challenge to the homocentric or anthropocentric morality is what she refers to as the animal liberationist, or animal liberationism. So So the animal liberationism position says that sentient animals have rights. So environmentalism, animal liberationists are both going to agree that it's not only humans that are direct objects of moral concern, but they do have a slight difference between them as to what is the primary member of the moral community, or the things that have this important moral standing. So to the environmentalist, we're just one small part of the natural world. Humanity is just one small part of the larger natural world. And so we should instead view ourselves as just kind of citizens of nature, instead of like dominating it and being like overlords of nature. The whole biosystem, according to environmentalists, is worthy of direct moral concern, not just human beings. So if you're an environmentalist, you would say we shouldn't destroy living things, but also we shouldn't destroy the environment. We're not above nature, we're just members of it, or to use a phrase of Aldo Leopold, who's an important author that's advanced this position, we should see ourselves as like citizens of nature. Another attack on the anthropocentric moral perspective comes from the animal liberationists, who say that the capacity for pain, in other words, sentience, is what gives something moral standing and makes it a member of the moral community. So the difference between the environmentalist viewpoint and the animal liberationist viewpoint is that the environmentalist is a little more holistic. It asks us to consider the entirety of nature as something worthy of protection and value, whereas the animal liberationist is a little more individualistic because it asks us to consider the importance, the dignity of each individual sentient creature. And the two perspectives, although they disagree with, they share in common a disagreement with anthropocentric morality, they do differ in certain ways. Let me give a quick question to see if you can follow the thought here. So suppose that hunting permits would be issued, or could be issued, for a certain predator in a certain natural environment, because the ratio of predator to prey has gotten out of balance. And so there's supposed too much prey, not enough predators. So we want to somehow bring the natural system back into balance a little bit. If hunting permits were issued and the reason for doing so was to try and correct the ratio of predator to prey, one of these two perspectives would be maybe okay with that, but the other would be opposed. So between environmentalism and animal liberationism, who do you think, which of those two views do you think would be more amenable to or open to the issuing of, say, hunting permits to thin out the herd of either predator or prey in an imbalanced ecosystem? Which of the two views would be okay with the issuance of these hunting permits if the reason for doing so was to, again, restore balance to the ratio of predator and prey for the overall sustainability and longevity of the and balance of the ecosystem? We're asking whether it's environmentalism or animal liberationist. Yes, that's right, Mary Jane, the environmentalist, because the environmentalist is concerned foremost with the total health of the environment instead of each individual animal in it. But if you're an animal liberationist, you would say that each animal that's being killed in that way is being deprived of its individual rights, and that's just wrong. So just a point to mention and consider, and I'll read you just some of her words about that. She says here, so homocentric morality is attacked by, sorry, I want to go up a little bit. The homocentric view of morality is challenged from two different directions. On the one hand, environmentalists argue that because humanity is only one part of the natural world, an organic species in the total biosystem, it is necessary for consistency to view all elements of that system, and not just ourselves, not just human elements, as valuable and worthy of moral concern. On the other hand, homocentric morality is attacked by animal liberationists who have argued that insofar as non-human animals can experience pleasure and pain and have sentience, they are worthy in their own right of moral concern. On the surface, at least, the animal liberationist ethic appears to be quite different from that of the ecologists, such as Leopold. The environmentalist view is holistic in its emphasis. It treats the good of the whole biotic community as the ultimate measure of the value of individual organisms and species and the rightness or wrongness of human actions. In contrast, the animal liberationist ethic is largely inspired by utilitarianism of Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. The latter tradition is individualist in its moral focus, in that it treats the needs and interests of individual sentient beings as the ultimate basis for conclusions about right and wrong. These differences in moral perspective predictably result in differences in the emphasis given to specific moral issues. Thus, environmentalists treat the protection of endangered species and habitats as matters of utmost concern, while, unlike many of the animal liberationists, they generally do not object to hunting, fishing, or rearing animals for food, as long as these practices do not endanger the survival of certain species or otherwise damage the natural environment. Animal liberationists, on the other hand, regard the inhumane treatment or killing of animals which are raised for meat, used in scientific experimentation, and the like, as just as objectionable as the killing and mistreatment of wild animals. They oppose such practices not only because they may sometimes lead to environmental damage, but because they cause suffering or death to the individual sentient beings. So, what's Warren's view then? Warren sees the possibility of coming up with the correct moral perspective on what's appropriate and inappropriate regarding our treatment toward animals, but she thinks that the right view is somewhat in between the differences of environmentalists and animal liberationists. She says, for example, that each view has to make a partial concession to get to the right moral perspective. For example, the animal liberationist must realize, she thinks, that although animals may have rights, they're not as strong as the rights of humans. And that means, for example, that animal rights could be more easily set aside for environmental or utilitarian reasons in ways that would not be acceptable in the parallel case of a human. On the other hand, she says the environmentalists have to realize that if trees, mountains, rainforests have rights, then those rights are very different from either the rights of humans or animals, since they're non-sentient aspects of nature. So then she has a structure in her paper going forward from there. In section 1, she tries to examine the basic argument given by animal rights advocates and show how their conclusions have to be modified to be more reasonable. In section 2, she tries to give 2 arguments for distinguishing between the rights of animals and humans. In section 3, she considers the animal rights advocate objection that if we make a distinction between the rights of humans and animals, that would endanger the rights of certain, like mentally disabled or non-paradigm, low cognitive functioning humans. And then finally, in the 4th and last section, she replies to various objections to the attempt to base moral rights on the degree of sentience that the entity has. So that's kind of a roadmap for us. Ultimately, Warren, I would say, is broadly anti-animal, but she tries to qualify that by making some concessions and having somewhat of a moderate middle ground view. So why some animals have some moral rights. That's the name of the first part of 4 parts that she talks about. So here we go. Let me say this. I'm looking at the total viewers, right? And we were up around like 20 or something, but now it's dipping. It got as low as 13, now it's 14. People that come and check in for this lecture are supposed to come and stay to the end. And when I'm going to look and take a photo of who's here, I'm going to take it at the end. And I'm going to take it at the end because I want to see who watched throughout the whole thing. So anybody that's trying to dip out early, you're doing the wrong thing. This class is supposed to have participation and attendance at every lecture. It's easier for you to attend this lecture than a physical lecture because you don't even have to go to a room. You just have to have a computer or a device turned on. It can even just be your phone. So you need to keep the stream running while I'm doing it live. And I am going to take a photo at the end. I don't appreciate people trying to just check in so that, I saw a number or I saw a name. And then later on, they're not there at the end. So when we're done at the end, I'm going to ask you guys to say goodbye, and I'll take a photo of that. But anyway, okay, so why some animals have some rights. Notice how she's qualifying what she's writing here. In fact, there's parentheses. I should rewrite that. Yeah, it's going back up a little bit. But I don't want to have to threaten people to do it. You should want to do the right thing. I mean, you're a student. You take a class. There's certain requirements. Anyway. Okay, so you see it there. Part 1, why, parentheses, some animals have some rights. There's a qualification built right into the way she writes the sentence out because it doesn't just say why animals have rights. It's qualified. It's why some, not all, animals have some, not all, rights. So she starts off by making reference to the writings and work of Peter Singer. Singer had said that all sentient animals should be regarded as, oh, not to worry, welcome back, Anthony. Talking about Singer, she refers to him, she makes a reference to him. So Singer said that all sentient animals, meaning creatures capable of feeling pleasure and pain, should be regarded as morally equal because interests should be given equal consideration when they're the same kind of interests. So the capacity to feel pain and the interest to avoid it is all that really matters morally from the Singer perspective. To disregard their pain, he argued, was speciesism. Now, other authors like Regan may adopt a similar or even stronger stance, like that they have rights that utilitarian considerations couldn't possibly override. Still, Warren notes, both authors seem to recognize some difference in the moral standing of animals versus humans, because notice that Singer says even if we live by the equal consideration principle, equal consideration is not exactly equal treatment, because there's some interest that we have that animals couldn't possibly have. And in those cases, there's no requirement to give equal consideration to such interests because they just don't exist. So I have an interest in being able to vote or being able to raise my voice using freedom of speech. But animals can't talk and they can't understand what elections are. So those interests don't apply or pertain to them. And even Singer recognized that. He said where we have common interests, like the desire to avoid pain, that's when we should accord the same regard to the same interest. But when the interests don't exist on the animal side, then there's nothing to regard. Even Regan said that animals have some of the same rights that we do. He knows that it would be silly and ridiculous to say they have all the same rights that we do, because again, the right to, practice whatever religion you want, or make political commentary that criticizes the status quo, or vote. These just don't apply to animals, once again, because of the lack of cognitive awareness they have of any of those things or concepts. Now, Warren says it's important for us to drill down and focus a little more clearly on why these differences exist, even in the view of Regan and Singer, between the moral standing or rights of animals as opposed to humans. That there is such a difference, she thinks, is obvious on the basis of a few intuitive considerations. She gives us a little thought experiment, which is, so suppose there's someone that's shooting squirrels for sport. You might think that they're acting in a bad way because there's nothing they can really do with the dead squirrel. It's not like it's big game. It's not like a lot of meat or a lot of fur. So if you were doing that, you'd pretty much be doing it for whatever sadistic pleasure that comes from like dominating and killing that animal. But she says, as bad as that might seem, compare it to a person who's shooting humans for sport. Someone gets up on like a watchtower and just starts picking off people with a long-range rifle. You'd probably agree, she thinks, that both of these are bad, but one of them's worse. And obviously it's worse in the case of the person shooting at the human beings. Now, some may say, well, that's just bias that's making us feel that way. We're humans. We care more about ourselves than other animals. So isn't that perhaps not necessarily a rational argument? It's just an expression of human-centered bias. But she doesn't agree with that. She says, no, there's a totally legitimate and rational basis to assign more value and importance to human life than to animal life. To answer why there is that difference, she says we need to consider certain relevant similarities and differences between ourselves and other animals. So what does it mean to say that an entity possesses a moral right? To say that some being has a right to something, to say that X has a right to Y, implies two things that she mentions on page 607. I'm going to put it in the chat. So to say that something X, which is just a placeholder for whatever the being might be, has a right to Y, where Y here is just a variable for whatever the content of the right might be, implies both of these two things. That number one, that it would be morally wrong for any moral agent to intentionally deprive X of Y without a good enough justification. And two, that this would be wrong because of the actual harm which it would do to the interests of X. Sorry. Okay, so let's just break that down a little bit. So for something to have a right, to say that something has a right to something implies these 2 points: that it would be morally wrong for a member of the moral community to deliberately take Y away from X without a good enough reason, and that why that would be wrong is because of the harm, the actual harm that it would do to the interests of X, that it would do to the interests of the being that's being deprived. It's not that it would be wrong because of the harm done to others or for some other indirect reason. So again, number 1 just says that if something has a right to something, what that means, among other things, is that it would be wrong to take that thing that it has a right to away from it deliberately without a good enough reason. And that would be wrong, number 2, because it would somehow do actual harm to the interests of the being that's being violated. So now, whether animals have rights to something depends on whether there are certain ways of treating them which are wrong because of the harm done to the animal's interests. The animal's interests. In some cases, we can clearly see that such rights exist. For example, a right not to be tortured, starved, confined, or general torturous, brutal, inhumane treatment. The animal has interest in avoiding that kind of pain and suffering, and we can obviously see that. So therefore, Warren accepts at least one view that's in line with an animal advocate, which is that animals have some basic rights, like the right not to be needlessly tortured or to made to be suffer for pointlessly suffer. But even in that case, she says, these rights are easier to override in the animal case compared to the human case. So now we get into part 2 of her paper, as I listed above, or as I mentioned above. We'll talk about it now. Part 2. And part 2 of the essay is entitled Human and Animal Rights Compared. Human and animal rights compared. So what she goes into next is this claim, and this is a key core claim of her paper, so this is one of the major moving parts. She says there's 2 sorts of differences between the rights of humans and animals. So there's 2 things to consider about rights overall. Two factors about rights. There's the content of the right and then the strength of the right. So the content of the right is what the right is a right to. That's the content factor about rights. The other factor is the strength of the right. The strength of the right refers to how strong or powerful the reasons have to be to legitimately override that right. So 2 factors about rights, content and strength. And now let's dig into that even a little bit more. So the content of a right is what the right is a right to. Not every right has the same content. Let me give you an example. One person could argue about the content of one right, the right to vote, okay? That's only one potential content though. What's a different one? If anyone here watching could maybe throw something out. You could speak about the right to vote or the right to something else. Anything else that comes to mind, like what? People talk about rights, and if they do, they may list out some of these variations, like right to speak, right? Freedom of speech. I have a right to political speech. You think about our Constitution, they'll say that we have rights of all kinds, speech, voting. What's something that's different from either of those? That's a good one, Santino. In the whole abortion literature, there was one that was debated a lot. Maybe someone will mention that. I don't know. Right to freedom of religion, sure. The right to practice whatever religion you choose. So speech, religion. They talk about the right to assemble. We said right to vote. There's of course the right to life. The right to marry. So anyway, you get the point. There's different contents. The right to vote is not the same thing as the right to freedom of religion, or the right to freedom of religion is not the same thing as the right to life. So she goes, Warren, she next discusses one right specifically, the right to liberty. Now, what does the right to liberty amount to? Well, it precludes imprisonment without due process in the case of a human, even if the prison is spacious and one does not physically suffer. So if I told you, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to capture you and force you to live in a basement, and you won't be allowed to leave, and I'll just bring you food and water and allow you to use a restroom. Do you think that your right to liberty would be respected if I, not me, but somebody did that to you? It's a pretty obvious answer, but I'm just trying to get you to think for a minute. Someone abducts you. Of course not, right? That's not, your liberty rights haven't been respected. Let me give you another example to follow up then. What if I said, okay, well, we're not going to just leave you in a basement and bring you food so you only have like a little room. We're going to give you 2 acres of space. You're going to have 2 acres of land to roam around on, but there's going to be electrified fence and snipers. So if you ever try to cross over that, you're going to get killed on sight. Now has your right to liberty been respected because I've given you more room? Or you think your right to liberty still hasn't been honored? Still no, exactly, right? Let me keep going a little farther, okay? What if I say, well, okay, then you need more room. How about I'll just give you the entire city of Fullerton? So the whole premises of Fullerton. But at the borders of Fullerton, once again, if you try to bypass that, you're going to be eliminated right away. Now do you have your right to liberty, or are we still saying no? Again, no. And as we scale out farther, what if I say, okay, you can only live in the state of California, but if you try to travel anywhere else in the world, you'll be killed. You'll probably still think I don't have my freedom of liberty. My freedom of movement has been restricted in a way that's incompatible with respect for that right. So what that shows is that if it's a human being, we think that there's almost no limitation on our freedom of movement and travel that would be consistent with having our liberty rights. But now let's go to the case of an animal. Suppose that we give an animal a spacious environment which basically approximates its natural habitat. Would you say that the right to liberty of the animal has been violated, or no? So we switch from human to animal. The author's view is that no, because the animal, unlike the human, can't be dreaming, thinking, pondering, contemplating all the possibilities of movement and travel that are being denied to it. If you're a human and you were told that you have to live your entire life in one city, you have enough cognitive information and understanding to know that that's depriving you of a whole wealth of potential experiences that you otherwise would have had if not for this limitation. Like, right, you're thinking, I want to someday, I don't know, go to Europe and check out the Eiffel Tower, or at least maybe travel more broadly through the country, go and see the Arch in St. Louis, or go to the Big Apple, New York, and walk around Times Square. All those things would be deprived of you, but as a human, you would know what you're losing, right? But imagine that we give an animal a large, spacious habitat that is basically approximately similar to the way that they would live in nature. It's not like the animal can be saying, well, I wanted to maybe travel the globe, or I wanted to experience different cultures or different cuisines, and these things are all being deprived from me. So the conditions which would be wrong in the human case don't significantly frustrate the needs, desires, or interests of the animal. Humans require an almost unlimited range of freedom of movement to avoid frustrating our needs and interests, but animals don't. I mean, look, we have pets. You've seen my little pet kitty. And, you know, I have a 4-bedroom house here. It's got a decent size, but it's not at all big enough for me to be happy. I wouldn't want to live my whole life trapped inside this house. But my cat is an indoor cat. We let her out in the backyard a little bit, but it's still, you know, got high walls, and it's a little additional room, but it's not as much room as you and me roaming all around the world and all around our cities, states, and, you know, various countries if you're an international traveler sometimes. But I don't feel that I'm violating her right to liberty, because as long as she's fed, housed, cared for, she's not perhaps able to contemplate all the limitations of experience that this surface area and etc. Prevents her from fully experiencing. So the point here is that when we talk about the right to liberty, and we compare the human right to liberty versus the animal right to liberty, it doesn't imply the same requirements on the two sides. Now, is there some limitation on animal liberty that would violate its interests? Maybe so. Suppose that we put the animal in a tiny cage, like they do in certain factory farms, and like this pig or chicken lives its entire life inside of a small little battery cage, and it can't even turn its body around. You know, in many cases, they kind of become manic. They become violent if they were not like debeaked in the case of the chickens and stuff. So that might frustrate their interests, but it's not the same thing as needing to have like a whole country to roam around in, or even the whole globe. So in this case, the author's point is that Oh, yes, Marina. Can we say there's a moral agency there? Is that what's differentiating the human scenario to the animal one? Yes, it has to do with the higher cognitive abilities of humans and the deeper awareness that we have of our circumstance as living things on this planet. Animals without language, without that kind of experience or insight or intuition, they can't be frustrated by treatment that would definitely frustrate a human if put in the same scenario. If you were forced to live on a farm or in a zoo cage, not a cage, I shouldn't say cage, but in a zoo, like, a habitat, but it's a small habitat, you'd be constantly frustrated by the way that you're imprisoned basically in that confining, limited domain. But an animal is not really frustrated in the same way. So the point here is that maybe animals do have a right to liberty, just like humans do. We have the same content, but their right to liberty is not as what as ours. Remember these two factors above. That's a big hint. So even when we can speak of an animal's right to liberty and grant that it has that right, it may just not be of the equal what? Same content, different. Can you finish that thought? Different strength, exactly. So the strength of the animal right to liberty is lower than ours. That doesn't mean that it's ridiculous to say they have a right to liberty. It just means that what would be required to frustrate or violate that right is different from what would be required to frustrate or violate the right of a human to the same. Now, many human rights don't even apply to animals: thought, speech, association, religion, and whatever. But where we have similar rights, it could still be the case that the content, that the strength, sorry, of the right the animal has to the same is not as powerful as our own. She says a similar thing about the right to life. Animals may have a right to life, but not on par with the human strength to that right. The reason is because they don't have the same capacity to value their lives in the way that we do. And Marina, rather, this could sort of co-align with your own contribution there, because lacking moral agency and maybe higher cognitive sophistication, they don't have the ability to project into the future their own existence as much. They don't anticipate themselves living out a full lifespan or understand the subtle details of what it means to reach their full advanced age. Humans, though, do. I mean, we plan for retirement decades in advance, and we're always aware of the bounded lifespan that we face. Animals, really, they don't have a full appreciation or thorough concept of what it is for life to discontinue. They just live in the moment, and they're not, unlike us, burdened with the existential dread of the knowledge of the inevitability of their, eventual death. So that's why, according to Warren, it's easier to justify violating the right to life of the animal that would not be as easy to justify in the case of a human being. Marina, maybe instead of moral agency, a better way to put it would be the cognitive abilities and strength then? Yes, these two things are often mentioned in conjunction with one another. That's why I kind of slip between mentioning the 2 points of comparison. But yeah, cognitive abilities are going to be related to the moral agency factor. So they're not completely unrelated, but they can be emphasized differently. That's for sure. That's very good. So animals lack long-range planning, long-range goals, the awareness of mortality. And for that reason, she thinks humans have a much more powerful and vested interest in the continuation of their own life. This might remind us almost a little bit of Michael Tooley way earlier in the course. Michael Tooley said that to have a right to something, you have to have the capacity to have an interest in that thing. And he said that animals and fetuses, of course, and even infants in his view, but let's focus on the fetus and the animal. He says they have, at that level of mental functioning, they don't have this comprehension of the concept of a continuing subject of mental experiences, or what it means for that experience to stop at some point. That's why he thinks lacking an interest in continuing to exist, there's no violation of a right to life when they're terminated, say in the womb if it's a fetus, or in the case of an animal, killed and used for meat. And that's why Warren thinks that, for example, the death of a bird is less tragic than the death of a human. That human life matters more to the possessor of the life because they understand more what it is that they stand to lose than a bird could possibly, or another animal could possibly understand. This doesn't necessarily mean that no animals have the right to life, but once again, her view is that even when and if they have the same right, the right to life, in terms of content, it can be weaker in strength. So in her view, the more plausible answer is that they have a right to life which is weaker in strength than ours. It's weak enough to justify killing animals if we have no other available means to provide food, clothing, or medical information for ourselves, but not for mere sport. In regards to pain, though, their interest in avoiding pain is equivalent to our own. They have the same insight and awareness of how bad pain is and how much they want to avoid it as we do. So their right to avoid torture, etc., is equivalent to ours in strength. But the right to life, the right to liberty, they're not on par with our own, at least not in terms of the scope and strength of them, because they have a lower limited awareness of the full application of liberty or life as a human understands it. Now, some say they don't have rights because they lack the capacity for moral judgment. But Warren doesn't go that far. She doesn't think they lack rights. Why should the capacity for moral judgment be a precondition for having rights? Many humans, of course, also cannot assert their rights, but that doesn't necessarily seem relevant in the case of, say, a mentally disabled human. But still, Warren does allow that the rights, though not a basis to deny them altogether, the fact that they have lower cognitive capacities may be a basis to say that humans have stronger rights than they do. Because we can understand the reciprocity of rights and duties as well. That also shows that we have more expectation of the moral treatment of ourselves and others, because we see ourselves as mutually cooperating to uphold a kind of social contract. But animals can't possibly comprehend that idea, so they can't expect to be treated as equals like humans can. So when they're not treated equally, it's less a violation of what they've come to expect, and therefore less a violation of something that they had an active interest in. Let me just read some of her words on that stuff. Here you'll hear her say it. So it says, consider the right to liberty. The human right to liberty precludes imprisonment without due process of law, even if the prison is spacious and the conditions of confinement cause no obvious physical suffering. But it's not so obviously wrong to imprison animals, especially when the area to which they are confined provides a fair approximation of the conditions of their natural habitat and a reasonable opportunity to pursue the satisfactions natural to their kind. Such conditions may exist in wildlife sanctuaries, well-designed zoos. They need not frustrate the needs or interests of animals in any significant way, and thus do not clearly violate their rights. Similarly treated human beings, on the other hand, being confined to, say, a prison-like reservation, would suffer loss of freedom. Human dignity and the fulfillment of the sorts of plans, hopes, and desires which appear to be uniquely human require a far more extensive freedom of movement than is the case with at least many non-human animals. Furthermore, there are aspects of human freedom, such as freedom of thought, speech, and political association, which just don't apply in the case of animals at all. So it seems that the human right to freedom is more extensive. It precludes a wider range of specific ways of treating human beings than does the corresponding right on the part of animals. Now, she makes an interesting point there. Some animals, for example, migratory birds or great whales, which naturally range over huge spatial regions in their lifespan, they may require as much physical freedom as human beings do to pursue the satisfactions natural to their kind, and that fact provides a moral argument against keeping them in captivity. And even chickens may suffer from extreme and unnatural confinement to which they are subjected on modern factory farms, but it still seems unnecessary to claim for most animals a right to freedom quite as broad as that which we claim for ourselves. Similar points may be made with respect to the right to life. Animals, it may be argued, lack the cognitive equipment to value their lives in the way that humans do. Another author argued that animals have no right to life because death is no misfortune for them. In her view, the death of an animal is not a misfortune because animals have no desires, which are categorical. I'm going to read down a little bit, skip that part. In other words, animals appear to lack the sort of long-range plans, hopes, and ambitions which give human beings such a powerful interest in continuing to live. Animals, it seems, take life as it comes and don't specifically know or understand that it go on. True, squirrels store nuts for the winter and deer run from wolves, but these may be seen as instinctive or conditioned responses to their present circumstances rather than evidence that they're contemplating the value of life as such. These reflections probably help to explain why the death of a sparrow is less tragic than that of a human. Human lives, one may say, have greater intrinsic value because they are worth more to their possessors. But this does not demonstrate that no non-human animal has any right to life. Next column. For these reasons, it's premature to conclude that the apparent intellectual inferiority of non-human animals, that they have no right to life. A more plausible conclusion is that animals do have a right to life, but that it is generally somewhat weaker than that of human beings. It's perhaps weak enough to enable us to justify killing animals when we have no other ways of achieving such vital goals as feeding or clothing ourselves or obtaining knowledge which is necessary to save human lives. Weakening their strength to the right to life in this way does not make it meaningless to say they have such a right. The point remains that some justification for killing a non-human animal is necessary. They may not be killed merely to provide amusement or minor gains in convenience. So, just kind of reporting on her and giving you some of her quotes there. So continuing on, some people may say, though, that this position has bad implications for the mentally disabled human beings. Because if the whole basis for setting the strength of one's rights is dependent on the lack of awareness they have of, their future, their mortality, etc., then you might say that also disqualifies from full strength rights to those things, not just the non-human animals, but also perhaps dangerous principle that could also extend to the, again, case of the mentally disabled or non-paradigm humans, low cognitive functioning humans. But here Warren, part 3 now, tries to give a case that non-paradigm humans should in fact have equal strength rights to paradigm humans, unlike the animals that she's comparing them to. So that's now part 3 of the paper, what she calls the moral rights of so-called non-paradigm humans. Non-paradigm humans is just her chosen phrase to refer to like the whole class of human beings that are mentioned that like would have mental cognitive disabilities, dementia, senility, or brain damage or whatever. Non-paradigm means like not optimal function or something. So what about the moral rights of non-paradigm humans? Her goal in this 3rd section is to try and carve out equal strength rights for them, even though she's already just now argued that the basis for disqualifying from equally strong rights to the animals is their lack of these kind of higher cognitive abilities. Now, that's an objection that's definitely made by Singer and both Singer and Regan. They both say any attempt to divide the moral community from humans and animals is going to cut off also certain humans that lack whatever attributes are used as the basis to make the distinction. And they say that consistency commits the opponent of animal rights to an untenable position, that humans of certain types also lack those rights, which seems to be, an abhorrent view. But Warren says no such conclusions follow. She says there are many reasons for granting strong moral rights to those non-paradigm humans that are not extended to animals. Now, why does she think then? Let me give you her reasons. So I've just put in the chat there Warren's reasons that she provides, again, that non-paradigm humans should have rights just as strong as paradigm humans. So the first one that she gives is to cover the case of infants and toddlers. You could argue that the infant, the toddler, in their current state anyway, they have that lower mental awareness and cognitive advancement to be aware of, the vicissitudes of life and death, the value placed on continuing to exist, and whatever else. So why is it wrong to, use them in the ways that we use animals if they have those lower awareness or capacities? She says that in their case, they have potential autonomy. So if it's just a healthy, typical human infant or toddler, you may look at them now and say, well, they don't have the higher level awareness that's a prerequisite for full strength rights. But they have the potential for it, though, the potential for it down the line in the future. And that, she thinks, is the distinguishing factor between them and the non-human animals that they're being compared with. But potential autonomy alone won't necessarily deliver all of the answers that she wants, because she's going to run into a little bit of a problem with her earlier writings on abortion. Can any of you watching this give me a quick statement, if you may, about why this seems to run into conflict with her earlier arguments? Because she's saying right now that an infant and a toddler has the same strength right to life as an adult human, because even if they lack autonomy now, they have the potential for it. That seems to be somewhat inconsistent with saying that what? If you remember back to her earlier work that we studied in the early part of the semester. Question, if she says potential autonomy is a valid basis to extend full strength rights to infants and toddlers, Can you tell me how you think there's some inconsistency issues possibly with her earlier arguments regarding abortion? Just take a moment of thought, but feel free to type it out when you're ready. Are you guys going to make Mary Jane do it again? It's fine if that's the case, but here we are. Mary Jane, potential goes against abortion since the rights of a person with more experience trumps the rights of the other. It doesn't go, so, right, yeah, if potential autonomy was a good enough reason to grant full-strength rights to the toddler or the infant, wouldn't that also apply to the fetus as well? But remember that she said in her abortion article that the fetus, just because it's currently not a person, it shouldn't be granted any kind of rights, including the right to life. That's why she thought abortion was okay. It wasn't wrong, because the fetus is not a person, at least not yet. And she talked about how, well, it has potential to eventually be a person, but she didn't think that really mattered very much. She said, well, potential personhood still doesn't give you a right to life anywhere near as strong as the actual person's right to life, or even right to bodily autonomy and so on. So how can she reconcile these two loose ends? In her abortion topic, she said, if you're not a person today, it doesn't matter if you have the potential to be one later after you develop, you don't have a right to life and you could be aborted, and that wouldn't be wrong. But now she's saying that, what justifies the unequal moral standing of a non-human animal and a, say, toddler or infant is that the toddler or the infant, unlike the non-human animal, has the potential for autonomy later. And now that's given as a basis to say that they should have full-strength rights. Wouldn't that also mean that the fetus should have full-strength rights? She has to come up with something to distinguish that. So she gives another reason. So reason number 2, the infant and toddler have not only potential autonomy, but also, and this is her phrase, partial autonomy. So she now makes another key distinction, because she wants to somehow separate the infant or toddler that's already been born from the fetus that's still in the womb. She says once the baby's been born and it's out of the womb, it's been delivered, it doesn't just have potential for autonomy, like lying in wait some way out in the future, but it's rapidly developing autonomy each day. It's embedded within a linguistic environment, it's taking in inputs from the parents that are talking, its cognitive capacities are rapidly developing as neural connections start to establish and grow. So you may say that once it's born, it's beyond just having potential autonomy, like a prospective future autonomy, but it's actually starting to develop it. And so it's got partial, not merely potential autonomy. The partial autonomy, I think, is, again, her way of trying to finesse this fine line between saying that a fetus, while it's being gestated, it's not out of the womb yet, so it hasn't even started to develop the autonomy yet. But the newborn or infant or toddler, it's gaining some of that each day and at an increasing rate. So that's the tiebreaker, I guess, between the fetus with only potential and the newborn or toddler with actually partial autonomy. But there's still another problem, though. What about the permanently mentally disabled individual that doesn't even have partial or potential autonomy? She also wants to classify them as members of the moral community with rights of equal strength to the rights of paradigm humans, and as opposed to non-human animals. What about them? The third reason number 3, then, to upgrade the strength of their rights to full strength on par with paradigm humans, is strong sentimental attachments. So suppose that there's a human that's not an infant or a toddler, but also, well, they could be an infant or toddler, honestly, actually, but it's just a human who not only is limited today from having autonomy, but is forever limited because of maybe a permanent disability or cognitive condition. According to what she's argued, with only the first 2 reasons, they would be relegated to being outside of the moral community or not having the same full strength rights because they don't have either partial or potential autonomy. What about them? Well, she says humans, even when they lack those abilities altogether, or even the potential for them, they still remain objects of intense moral concern and value to the rational members of the moral community that vest interest in them. So potential autonomy can cover the case of the toddler or infant, but also partial autonomy And if neither of those apply, it's the strong sentimental attachments that come in and kind of serve to give us the same result as an alternative. I'm reading here her words on that. She says, part 3, infants and small children are granted strong moral rights in part because of their potential autonomy. But potential autonomy, as I've argued elsewhere, is not in itself a sufficient reason for the ascription of full moral rights. If it were, then not only human fetuses, but even ununited human sperm egg pairs would have to be regarded as entities with a right to life equivalent to our own, thus making not only abortion, but even birth control the moral equivalent of murder. Those who don't find this extreme conclusion acceptable must appeal to reasons other than potential autonomy of infants and children to explain the strength of the latter's moral rights. One reason for assigning strong moral rights to infants and children is that they possess not just potential but partial autonomy, and it's not clear how much of it they have at any given moment. And then it says, analogous arguments explain why strong moral rights should also be accorded to other non-paradigm humans. The severely mentally disabled or incurably senile, for instance, may have no potential for moral autonomy, but they are apt to be friends. There are apt to be friends, relatives, or other people who care what happens to them. Like children, such individuals may have more mental capacities than are readily apparent. Like children, they're more apt to achieve or return to moral autonomy if they're valued and well cared for. Furthermore, any one of us may someday become mentally incapacitated to one degree or another, and we would all have reason to be anxious about our own futures if such incapacitation were made the basis for denying strong moral rights. So there are then sound reasons for assigning strong moral rights even to human beings who lack the mental capacities which justify the general distinction between human and animal rights. Their rights are based not only on the value which they themselves place on their lives and well-being, but also on the value which other human beings place on them. So, yeah, that's the thing. As an example, the Mona Lisa painting has no autonomy. It's just an inanimate object, but people care a lot about it. The whole global community, Western culture, and the art community, obviously, they place immense value on that kind of classic, priceless piece of art. So it would be wrong for you to destroy it, not because it has autonomy, but because of the strong invested interest and attachment that we have to it. So on par, perhaps, with the Mona Lisa, the non-paradigm human that is permanently unable to acquire autonomy would still be something that we place immense value in, not only for its own sake, but also for the larger kind of reciprocity that we hope we will receive if we ever fall into such a condition, unfortunately on our own. So that's her kind of interesting, subtle, nuanced way of trying to finesse this fine line between saying animals don't have the same full strength rights as we do, and yet non-paradigm humans seem to have the same full strength rights that we do, even though they're lacking in some of the cognitive capacities. But unlike animals have neither potential nor partial autonomy, and they're also perhaps not in the same category of things that we apply such strong sentimental attachments to either. Now, the final section of her paper, I don't want to say much about it because it's kind of like an afterthought, honestly. But so just to sort of get into the major points, we see here that just because animals lack moral autonomy doesn't mean they lack all rights, but yes, the lack of autonomy or higher cognitive ability may make some of their rights comparably weaker than ours. And that kind of contradicts in the animal liberationist perspective that just having sentience by itself is enough of a basis to grant you the same full strength rights that we enjoy. She does know, though, that some people will still find a couple of additional leftover criticisms. One might say that to argue that animals have rights of any type has absurd consequences for their natural relationships with each other. For example, if animals have rights, then when the predator kills prey, is the predator violating the right to life of the prey? Wouldn't that be absurd if we said, these predatory animals are committing murder and they're doing something that's morally wrong? But she says that's a silly objection because obviously granting animals rights does not necessarily mean that we're advocating the elimination of predatory-prey relationships in nature. First off, predators are not moral agents like us, so the morality of what they're doing doesn't even apply to them. Even if they were moral agents, the fact that they're killing and eating these other animals is not done for sport, it's done for mere survival, which if it was necessary for humans to eat animals to survive, like literally, then it would be just as acceptable. Also, she mentions that when animal predators kill other animal prey, they don't confine them in like factory farm settings for the entirety of their life, which amounts to sort of brutal torture. They're killed on the spot and eaten on the spot through the attack itself. Another thing that some people might object to is that if we try to base rights on the level of intelligence or mental function that something has, or the strength of it anyway, on those factors, maybe that would create ridiculous complexities in our moral reasoning. For example, what's morally worse, if I eat like 10 oysters or one chicken? You could argue that the oyster is like a mollusk and it has much less cognitive awareness of anything going on in its environment, whereas the chicken has a great deal more of at least, some perceptual awareness and mental comprehension of the scenario that it's in. But how can we play these things off against each other? Like how many oysters being killed is equivalent to the suffering, pain, or loss of one chicken or pig or something. But to that, she easily just writes it off. She says those are kind of ridiculous, abstruse philosophical speculations that are far removed from the real moral factors that we actually consider when we determine what's right or wrong to do in our relations with animals. Now, there's only one other author. His material is very brief. It's not going to take me much time to explain it, but I do want to just gesture towards what he's going to say, and that's Roger Scruton. Roger Scruton is the last author in our unit here, and his paper is called The Moral Status of Animals. So I'm just going to run through it very quickly because there's not much to say. He's first off just a straight up, he's kind of a more conservative philosopher overall in all of his writings. And he argues that animals don't have any rights. And he just appeals to the reasons given by like Kant and others that are familiar to us by now, that they lack rationality, self-consciousness, moral self-governance. So they don't have rights because of all those things. He says if they were given rights, they would also have to have duties, because rights and duties are correlative with one another. If I have a right to something, I have a duty to accord the same treatment to other members of the moral community. So if I have a right to life, I'm obviously not just protected from being killed, I'm also not supposed to kill others. But animals can't understand that, if they're vested with a right to life or something else, then they're supposed to honor the same rights in others. If a thing had rights, it would have obligations, and if it defected in those obligations, then it could be held accountable. Like if a person violates your rights, you can sue them or maybe hold them accountable legally or in court. But it would make no sense to take an animal to court, for a deprivation of your rights, because it couldn't even understand the nature of the proceedings. So Scruton says treating animals like persons with rights would actually do them a disservice, because it would ignore what they actually are and what they can actually understand. A person is a member of the moral community with full and equal rights, but creatures incapable of moral reasoning have neither rights nor duties. If they had rights, we would need to respect their autonomy in the same way that we do with people. So, for example, before you take in a pet, you'd have to ask its permission. Would you voluntarily grant me the permission to take you into custody? Which, of course, makes no sense because they have no mechanism by which they could even understand the proposition. We need consent for captivity, training, or putting them to any other human use. And if they all have rights, then we're in the silly position of, again, calling the predators immoral and rights violators of their prey. So really giving them rights would misunderstand the nature of what they are. Instead, Scruton says that we just need to think about what kind of relation that we stand into animals. And he says there's 3 important human to animal relationships. So number 1, animals as pets. Number 2, animals, farm animals. And 3, wild animals. So Scruton says talking about what we owe the animals, just in general terms, is too broad and not specific enough. We need to talk about which human-to-animal relationship we're specifying, and they each have a different set of expected informal obligations associated with them. So don't just ask, what do we owe the animals? Ask, what do we owe the animals that are pets, or that are farm animals, or that are wild animals? And each case is different. The clearest set of extensive obligations pertains to the first human-to-animal relation as pets. When you take in an animal as a pet, you're inducing its total dependence on you for survival and care. So it makes perfect sense then for you to be expected to what? What should we do for our pets? Not just feed them, but care for them, provide some kind of emotional support and love to them throughout the duration of their natural lives. Farm animals, they don't expect that kind of treatment from us. The farm animal doesn't expect you to go playing with it, to take it for a walk. All they look at a human caretaker as is like their custodian that provides them with straw, hay, space to graze in. We're kind of like, in that case, a much more minimal set of expected obligations, or the norms that structure that relation are much different than the ones that structure the relation to pets. So how it's appropriate to interact with pet animals is not the same as what's appropriate in interactions with farm animals, where the obligations to them are more limited. And then wild animals, I mean, it's really best for you to just not interact with them at all, because that would be a dangerous interaction for you. So maybe the best we can say about the wild animals is not to wantonly destroy them or kill them for no good purpose, or to not destroy or obliterate their natural environment. But it doesn't require that we feed them at all. It doesn't require that we play with them or give them, house and shelter. So he says, don't ask what we should do for the animals, ask what we should do for the pets or the farm animals or the wild animals. And depending on which case it is, you get a different answer in each case. I'm going to summarize that and give you a little bit more final details, but that's basically it. So now you've heard from all the authors on the animal topic, and next week we just have a little miniature unit of the class, which is about economic inequality and whether we owe anything or have more obligations to the global poor. So let's go ahead and adjourn. Feel free to say goodbye, guys, and I'll let you go. Don't want to hold you any longer because we've reached the end of our time. So thanks, everybody. Thank you so much. I appreciate all you guys, and I'm just gonna, wait until I can snap one quick pic. Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Santino, Amanda, Mary Jane, Rosemary, Jasmine, Nick, Zach, Tyler, Cayenne, Jemin, Marina, Michelle, Yelena, the core group. All you guys are doing great, and I appreciate all your hard work. Question for me, what is it, Jemin, before we go? Is the final cumulative? Yes, 100%. Sandra, thank you too. Have a good weekend. I'll be sending out the study guide next week, and you'll be able to start looking at it, and then we'll use that for 2 review sessions that we will conduct during week 15. That's the basic plan. You'll see it in the schedule too. But yeah, I'll be posting that on Canvas probably no later than Tuesday. Okay. All right, guys. Thanks again. Appreciate it. And for now, have a good one, and stay safe. I'll see you on Tuesday. Thanks.